Yeah. See.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have our last session of the day, but certainly not least. This is a panel on closing the digital gap in partnership with the Digital Impact in Governance Initiative at New America. You're welcome to submit questions, and our moderator, Tamika Tilleman, will take them time permitting. And without further ado, I'll hand things over to Tamika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and thanks to the amazing GBBC team for putting this all together. It is a pleasure to be with you all today. And those of you who have survived to Friday afternoon on a UNGA Friday are doing something right, so congratulations. It has been worth the wait because we have with us some of my absolute favorite human beings, not only in the blockchain ecosystem, but on the planet. This is an exceptionally good crew. And we're going to have a marvelous conversation today about a topic that, frankly, is as timely as it is important. And so this is a really urgent set of issues that we will be exploring. I want to frame this and start with Sheila by just asking us to think through the implications of the pandemic. This, in some ways, is kind of a best of times and a worst of times for those of us that work on digital. The need for digital services has never been more urgent, and we are seeing in country after country all over the planet, our lives are shifting online. That's proving really exciting and lucrative for some people, and it's also creating a lot of challenges for those that are getting left behind. Help us understand how you're thinking through this, and we'll go into some more details around what solutions are working and what do you see that's really encouraging. But how is this playing out from your vantage point at the World Economic Forum?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think the context is really important. And so in addition to the pandemic, here on the West Coast, we've got wildfire, we've got power outages happening up and down the eastern seaboard, and certainly other places around the world. We've got civil unrest. So there's a confluence of events, I think, that the pandemic unleashed that were really waiting. They were brewing and simmering, and they've really spilled over. And so part of what I think we're focusing on is the gap, the divide that you mentioned. And how do we think about this, not just from the standpoint of increased technology, but also about basic infrastructure? Because a lot of the infrastructure failures are actually amplifying digital divide in ways that really aren't about the technology itself. Access to power is something quite fundamental, and we're seeing how much that is proving to be an impediment to the ability for anyone to access new innovation. So it's things like this, I think, going almost back to basics and really trying to take stock of where are we on that. If you create a Maslow's technical, hierarchy, where really are we? And the reality is we're far lower down than I think we, some of us knew this, but now the evidence is abundantly clear and cannot be ignored.
Paul and Marta, I want you to help us understand this a little bit more. Both of you have unique vantage points when it comes to developing infrastructure solutions that have really broad applicability. Paul at EY, Marta, and the incredible legal work that you are leading with many different actors at Ropes and Gray. What are you seeing in this space that provides cause for encouragement? And what are you saying that frankly puts up some red flags and that we should be paying attention to? Paul, we'll start with you.
So what we're seeing is the pandemic has been the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for businesses that were in a relatively weak position. And the distribution of benefits has been very uneven. So the companies that were already relatively digital, that were already fairly comfortable, they are taking this transformation in stride, right? People shifted. I know in our business, we shifted to working from home and really did not miss a beat. People miss each other, kind of seeing the work in the office, but from a production standpoint, everything went ahead smoothly. We've seen other companies really grind to a halt. They've put their spending on hold. So this is having a very uneven impact on the business. It's also accelerating the shift towards solutions that are effective and easy to deploy. So it's much harder to bring people in and do very complex whiteboarding sessions and lots of planning. So the result of that is companies need a rapid deployment solution. It's had a big impact on how we think about how quickly you can deploy solutions for clients and what we need to do to make them faster. But it's remarkable how uneven the impact is going to be. Some firms are just doing very well and going like gangbusters, and others have just sort of like gone into a deep freeze.
I've heard it said that we've condensed 8 years of digitization into 8 weeks. I think certainly your firm and others are experiencing that. Marta, what about on your end? You really have an unusual vantage point on how these solutions are being leveraged in the real world to solve problems.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the thing that has been most encouraging for me during the pandemic is seeing the Open COVID Pledge. So the idea there is that a bunch of companies have pledged their patents to be used by anyone for free to end the COVID pandemic. And so you've had this giant consortium of companies, including Facebook and Amazon and IBM and HP, come together. And, a lot of these are companies that you don't necessarily think of as being a big proponents of open innovation. A lot of proprietary companies on that list, but they've come together and are offering their patents to the public in order to end the pandemic, which I think is pretty cool, actually, and very encouraging.
Ernesto, I want you to take a slightly different spin on this. You have deep visibility into the Global South and solutions that are being adopted in the Global South. A generation ago, when we witnessed a somewhat unanticipated revolution in technology and telecommunications, which was the shift to mobile technology and mobile phones, many countries in the Global South leapfrogged copper lines and went straight to mobile. And it proved to be a really decisive moment in the development of their economies, the development of their technology ecosystems, because they didn't have the legacy systems to kind of weight them down. They weren't encumbered the same way that countries in the global north were. Is there any chance we're going to see something similar come out of this? Are there specific systems that you see starting to be utilized in the global south that could have a big impact? Ernesto, I think you may be on mute. I'm not hearing you, unfortunately.
Sorry.
There we go. That's better.
The digital divide is the main inequality of access to internet. The most important to do is increase broad to suppress collaboration between government, companies, and civil society. The technology is an opportunity to lead prosperity. One is possible to do government is the public goods. It's very, very important to define the digital public goods like open source software, open data, open standard, open content, that adhere to privacy and the other application best practice, and they are aligned with the Union Nation Sustainable Development Goals or the AS. This is very important too. Another point to development in this epoch, this blockchain 2.0 is smart contracts. Blockchain 3.0 is application of the apps, decentralized application. It's necessary to increase the acquisition with the other people, especially in the development countries, to have access to the dApps. dApps like a public digital goods. This is I think that about this.
Sheila and I and a number of others spent a big chunk of our morning today launching a big global effort together with a number of presidents and prime ministers and other leaders from around the world around digital public goods. And there was a realization that if we are going to get where we want to go with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we're going to have a digital decade where we invest a lot of energy in the creation of digital infrastructure that will support our nations. And if you look back on the 20th century in the same way that greater access to clean water or electricity or roads unlocked enormous human potential during that period, We need to do something similar today, but it has to be digital. And the advantage, as you alluded to, Ernesto, is that if we build solutions on an open source basis, we can accelerate that progress and make it a lot more affordable, hopefully closing the gap a little bit. But Sheila, let me ask you to build on some of the thoughts that we shared this morning. How do you see blockchain and data, where you play a really unique role in the ecosystem, filling a need in the realm of digital public goods? What can be done to leverage these tools to provide more opportunities to people that are currently on the margins of the global economy?
Well, where I see these two things combining in the way that I'm most excited about is in the area of identity. So just thinking through DIDs, digital identity, basically identity differentiators, and thinking through self-sovereign identity and how we can actually provide more ownership and control over identity to an individual citizen, just in that context. And I think the connection of the two, having a blockchain-backed digital identity, enables you to think more responsibly as a society about data deployment. So how do we ensure veracity of data, integrity of data, control over data, and data, I mean, clearly is the underpinning of our entire society. I think moving forward, particularly as we enter this digital decade, or as we try to really encourage the sparking of this digital decade and new digital infrastructure. And so having those core components in place and the combination of those two, I think, is critical. And what I'm seeing, and I'm hoping to see more of, is an acknowledgement of blockchain more formally beyond the kind of fintech use case, which is very, very popular and well known, and really the data use case. So part of what we've been waiting for, I think, is latency issues, things like this that we had to kind of resolve, energy issues, things like this. But as we get there, technically, I think it's going to be very important for us to understand how we can build the tech stack to accommodate a blockchain-backed infrastructure that permits this kind of, frankly, this kind of philosophy around data that is relatively revolutionary.
Paul, help us unpack this a little bit more, both as it relates to data and as it relates to identity, where you've done an enormous amount of work. When we look at the landscape of digital public goods and think about closing the digital divide, identity is really at the foundation of that. If you don't have good digital identity solutions in place, you're not going to get that far. What needs to happen in order to make these solutions a reality for more people? We've seen some really hopeful cases emerge all over the planet over the last decade or so, where countries have cracked the code more or less on digital identity, or at least they're moving rapidly in the right direction. What's your advice on how we solve that problem? And then how do we kind of continue to build on that solution when it comes to data?
So there are really, in my mind, kind of two critical things. So the first is, there's a joke I always like to say, which is, you can go around saying as much as you want that, hey, I am Batman. The reality is, though, you are who the government says you are, right? That is the foundation of identity. That's how we get our passports. And as much as self-sovereign identity is a fun idea, the truth is we need governments to carefully engage around identity and to create a mechanism whereby people can have their identity validated, they can have a third party verify it, but they also can have control over the documentation. It's portable, it's usable, and it's open and accessible in the different networks. More broadly speaking, whether it's identity or other services, what we've seen over and over again over the last 30 years is that digital transformation has mostly caused a centralization of power in the hands of very, very large enterprises. And what I believe is transformational and valuable about blockchain is, done correctly, we can have applications that allow for shared information, that allow for shared business rules and logic, without causing this massive accrual of power into centralized organizations. The truth is the vast majority of the world's entrepreneurs are sole proprietors, right? So their identity, their access to capital, and their business future are all tied up together in their identity. And from that, they need to be able to generate cash flow. They need to be able to generate working capital. And blockchains provide the ability to seek out individuals, to loan them money, to do the financial services that they need to put that money to work. And right now, in the centralized platform model, there's too many participants who've accrued so much power that they are able to take a disproportionate share of the value created. So what I'm excited about, especially for small businesses, is I believe blockchains create a much more level playing field, and specifically public blockchains, right? Where there's no central authority that can decide tomorrow that they'd like to change the terms on which you operate, the way you interact, right? There are millions and millions of small businesses that need a level playing field if they're going to grow and build any kind of sustainable model for themselves.
Help us, Marta, dig in a little bit deeper on this, because it's a really important point, and there are a couple of layers here, and Paul alluded to this. But right now we're living in a world where there are really two data models. One that we see predominantly in authoritarian countries is that the government gets everything, and they have access to that. They are able to use that information to surveil populations and to suppress dissent and a variety of other activities. And then the other is the big tech model, in which one company, as Paul alluded to, or a small handful of companies in Silicon Valley and Seattle, get access to all our information, and they're able to monetize that. I heard Chamath Palihapitiya a while back liken this to a feudal system in which we all put in our information, and we do that generally for free, and a handful of individuals with access to the algorithms and the data sets are able to monetize that, and they make a ton of money off of that. A lot of the firms that you advise are building the infrastructure that could theoretically take us in a pretty different direction toward a more decentralized model. When are we going to get there? Are we going to get there? How do you see this unfolding?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the most important and exciting things for me about blockchain technology is its ability to take the privacy protections that exist in the offline world and put them potentially into the online world. So digitization itself, I think, is not necessarily inherently good. Really, technology amplifies intent, as it's been said. And I think that, when you saw photos coming out of the Hong Kong protests, there were these really striking photos to me of people lined up at subway stations, really long lines, because they wanted to use cash instead of using some sort of digital card, because they didn't want to be placed at the scene of the protests. And so I think that really underscores that when you are moving towards a digital future, and in this case, a cashless future, you're really moving towards the potential for a surveillance society, right? A cashless society is a surveillance society. And so for me, the thing that's really important about blockchain technology is its potential to actually move those types of protections that you have with cash into the digital sphere. So you can actually make online transactions without necessarily having your identity tracked and surveilled. So for me, that's the most important part of this technology.
Ernesto, how do you see this playing out in the geographies and the companies that you're working with? Obviously, a critical set of issues. I wouldn't say that anybody in the world has solved this completely, but you have unique insights across a large number of different countries. Who do you think is doing well, and who, frankly, needs to up their game a little bit?
Okay, in developing countries, we are delayed for many things, for regulations, for technology, but it's necessary to support, for example, the project ID Sovereign, or ID 2020, for brought to the main countries to the developing countries. We need new regulations based in a consensus of the countries. The Union nation can support that. Other thing very important to do is apply the Presidio Principles. I think that it's very important the transparency, accessibility, interoperability, security, accountability, and governance. The consignment rights seek to guarantee for main development pillar focuses in the transparency, privacy, interoperability, and governance. It's very important to generate the Bill of Rights of blockchain. The blockchain constitution is the adoption right now in the countries development like US or Europe or something like that. It's very fast translate to the developed country when this is a standard. For example, the ODS. ODS, the people acquisitions to the ODS for the main countries and for brought to the other countries. I think that it's very important to working in the Presidio Principles. This is very important because when they apply these principles, the trust is more important, is more easy the regulations, because the people do have questions about the solutions, the technology. The people, there's no trust in the technology because maybe the data protection is a problem or governance or whatever. No, the main is working very important to proceed the principles, I think.
So Sheila, I saw you smile when Ernesto brought up the Presidio Principles, as did I. I know these have been a labor of love for you and your team. Many of our participants at Blockchain Central today, I expect, are very familiar with the Presidio Principles, but some I imagine are not. Provide an overview of what they are and what role they play in our ecosystem.
Sure. And first, Michael, I'll just highlight your seminal importance to the creation of this, along with other members of the Forum's Global Blockchain Council. And thank you again for that engagement.
A great team effort.
Yeah, definitely. Certainly a labor of love, labor and love, both being important to prominently highlight there. I think this came about as a result of the Forum's Global Blockchain Council, which was a group that had very strong and very disparate and divergent views on the role of blockchain, the type of protocol, and all these kinds of things. And what we agreed on very quickly, despite our different perspectives, was the need, Ernesto, to your point, to have something along the lines of a Bill of Rights that would ensure that the core principles that underlie decentralization, term jour, would remain intact as applications were built on top of the protocol. And so what the principles are intended to embody is almost like a code of conduct, a way of kind of embodying these ideas in the design process and piloting phase and all kinds of other things to, again, ensure that we're not just taking a decentralized protocol and building a highly centralized application on top of it, which is not to say that that is always a bad thing, which is if we do that, we need to be honest about it and be more transparent about what aspects of the blockchain we are actually engaging with and what aspects we're almost, trying to suppress in the application layer. So they're open for signatory by everyone. We released them actually rather quietly. We have over 100 organizations that have signed up from all over the world, large, small, big enterprises, small startups, governments, and others that have engaged with them. And we certainly encourage everyone to consider them. And in some cases, really wrestle with them. It can be challenging to wrestle with them as people go out into the space and begin to or continue to build.
Well, I know that we've had a lot of signatories to the Presidio Principles from the GBBC community. I hope there will be many more. It's an amazing and really critically important effort. Paul, I want to come to you with a question that Jason Brett from Forbes just wrote in, specifically directed to you, which again is closely related to some of these themes that we've been unpacking a little bit. And it's on digital identity. He says, what about China and digital identity? Is the government always the key to identity, or can decentralized identity solutions on a blockchain help close the digital gap? This could go any number of directions. What's your take on it?
So that's a really tough one for me because I don't think of myself as an absolute expert on digital identity. Governments are incredibly important for most people in validating their identity. And, the Chinese government has a particularly powerful role in their country with regard to that. And there are a number of really, really good things that the Chinese government is doing with regard to advancing the state of blockchain and it's probably something worth digging into, but it's much more at the enterprise level that I think really amazing stuff is happening in China. I think when it comes to people who are stateless, who are undocumented, almost any form of decentralized model that allows them to gather some pieces of their identity from different sources in a verifiable way will help them move forward. And so there is an important role for decentralized systems. There's an extremely important role for decentralized systems in validating the truthfulness of your statements, even when you depend on some level of government supplied identity or verification as part of the process.
Marta, if you can, help us understand some of the legal questions surrounding this, because if we follow this path to its natural conclusion, eventually individuals are going to own a lot more of their data, which is really exciting and really promising, and there's some great things that can come with that. But for any of us that has ever looked at a terms of service agreement, it's also a pretty daunting prospect. And the fact that individuals will have greater custody and greater responsibility over their information comes with some challenges as well. What are some of the legal issues that we should be thinking about and trying to get ahead of if we want to close the digital divide and make sure that the gap that we're seeing right now isn't perpetuated as we move toward more decentralized systems?
Sure. Yeah. Well, you know, for better or worse, we have to deal with Earth law sometimes. And so one of the things that we've seen is there are all sorts of really, really exciting potential.
Can I quote you on Earth law? That's my favorite term of the day.
Yes, absolutely. That's a phrase I use often with my clients as sort of my excuse. I'm really sorry, it's not me. It's Earth law. So you know, when you have all these really cool and exciting applications that legislators maybe don't necessarily understand, at the same time, you have all these really well-intended laws coming out, like particularly we're talking about data, so privacy laws. And when you're talking about data privacy laws, what we've seen over and over again, you know, in California, in New York, and Europe, is that these data privacy laws make some assumptions about how companies and data processors operate. And so one of those assumptions is that data can be deleted. That's a really important assumption in most of these laws, and fundamentally doesn't work with blockchains. And so that's potentially a problem for when we're building these really awesome solutions. They also often require some sort of centralized processor, someone you can point to as, you know, the person who is responsible for this data. And both of these things make it really difficult for blockchain companies to comply potentially. So it's really important for legislators to understand, because I think fundamentally the principles that are behind these laws are the exact same principles behind these potentially very cool uses of blockchain. So I found that when you sit down and explain this to legislators and explain that fundamentally their intent is in line with blockchain technology, they're much more willing to think about ways to ensure that they're not making blockchain use cases illegal.
Ernesto, as you look at these issues, I want to ask you a question that I'm going to ask all of our panelists in a moment, which is, if you could give advice to governments that are wrestling with these challenges, what's one thing you would tell them to do? What is a change they should make that's going to give us the best chance of success when it comes to deploying these systems? And hopefully, you know, along with that, avoid some of the negative potential outcome, which we all acknowledge is a real possibility. We don't know how this movie ends, and we don't want to presume that these technologies are going to lead us to a blissful future. There could be some real unfortunate implications if we're not careful.
Okay, the first, the DPG, or digital public goods, aligned to the SDG. It's very important right now to align, because the world is the world needed to align these concepts. Other thing important, we need repeat again, and new regulation, world regulation. This regulation is based in consensus country, like a blockchain, a blockchain global. No, the government, the main problem is the politicians don't understand blockchain and fighting for the unknown. This is the problem. This is the danger right now, because they needed to have education for the politicians. The technology is a way, a friendly way, but the people, the politicians don't see that. Yes, it's very important to working in the education to politicians. It is necessary to have politicians very educated in the fourth revolution, and very important in the decentralized, how the citizens working decentralized with the technology that like blockchain. Other point in the last, I think the solutions, the like I did, for example, maybe are digital good publics, or declared digital good public. It's very important to the people, poor people especially, have access to these kinds of the technology. It's also important to have access to the telecommunications. The divide digital is necessary combat or fight, because there exists right now many people to have access to internet. This is a good problem. Yeah.
Sheila, what about you? I know you do this all day, every day, so it's probably not the most challenging question you will receive, but what's one piece of advice you would pass along to governments that want to get this right?
Well, it's the one piece thing that is actually quite challenging. But what I decided to answer.
We'll give you 2 or 3. How's that?
Yeah, I'll go with one on the data side. And I think it's this. If you are not, as a government, if you are not thinking about laying a path, at the very least, towards flexible regulation of data, then, and if you're really thinking that it's a black and white kind of thing, then you are ultimately going to impede or hamper the ability of your citizens to engage in the global digital economy. I think that is, all the trend lines are showing that the need to provide variable or flexible access to certain kinds of data for certain kinds of purposes, et cetera, is the way that the world is moving. And attempts to stymie that, while I understand where they come from, need to really take into account the need for a flexible consent mechanism or other kinds of mechanisms. That there are many different options that exist, some technical, some regulatory, to accommodate that reality.
Fantastic. Paul, what about you?
So like Sheila said, like getting it down to one piece of advice is tough, but I think if I were to give one piece of advice, it's different from the other ones that have been given. I would say competition policy matters, right? If you think about how we make our economies more functional, how we distribute value to end users and individuals, it comes in a highly competitive marketplace. And so I encourage regulators to think about, how do you break up monopolies? Right? How do you make sure that many companies have access to the kind of technology, the assets, the data that's required for them to build competitive products?
And Marta, round us out on this question of advice to government. What should those in power be doing if they don't want to mess this up?
Well, I think in terms of incentivizing technological progress, one thing that we've seen over and over again is that open source models and open innovation have really pushed things forward. And one thing that I'm always flabbergasted by is when we have research and technology that's funded by the government, i.e. taxpayers, that is ultimately proprietary, and you have folks paying, again, and as opposed to having this technology open to the public for free. And so I think it's really important for governments to consider opening up their technology and not double taxing their citizens to really incentivize a more open and collaborative innovation structure.
Well, Marta and I did not plan this, but I'm going to pause for a brief commercial break because she teed it up so perfectly. This morning, our team at New America announced a new partnership with the Open Contracting Partnership, which is the global body that works on government procurement issues, to help more governments around the world gravitate toward open data, open standards, and critically open source. Because we have $12 trillion of leverage in the form of government procurement each year. And the fact that we are not using that leverage effectively to create more open source solutions is really a lost opportunity. So we're excited to see what comes out of that. I'm also excited by the flurry of applause and hearts that we're getting from the audience on this. So clearly it resonates with those at Blockchain Central as well. But we encourage all of you who are interested in this space to continue to engage with us. I think there's a lot of good work to be done. We have about 5 minutes left, and in that time, I want to do something dangerous, which is ask each of you to look into your crystal ball. And I am going to prognosticate on my end that in 10 years, on the 18th of September 2030, some gathering of this sort is going to convene. Hopefully, we will all be there. It is a Wednesday, just for those of you that want to mark your calendars now. And we will be looking back on what has worked, hopefully spectacularly, over the last decade. Help us paint a picture of what are the things, what are the innovations that 10 years from now will have made a difference in forging a digital decade? What are the big foundational solutions that we will be using every day in our lives and will have reoriented our economy and our society, hopefully in ways that provide for greater equity and a smaller digital gap than we're seeing today? Ernesto, I know that's a big question, but we know you're up to it. So over to you on that one.
Okay, in 10 years, I have many things. Appears the fifth revolution industrial. I think so. World decentralized, empowerment in the citizen and the government that permits, and less divide digital, new education, new way of business, new working way. This.
Fantastic. Sheila.
Well, I think prediction-wise, I think everyone will be engaging with the blockchain. Nobody will be talking about blockchain. So number one, I think that's the reality. I also think that we will have come up with new ways to more equitably allocate monetization of data. We will have shifted, I hope, I actually believe, to more of a stakeholder model that thinks about risk and reward at the same time and engages in apportionment that provides more distribution along the entire value chain to various stakeholders. So I hope that in turn will lead to a reduction in the massive inequality that we're seeing in society.
Our mutual friend Dante Disparte, the vice chair of Libra, always says that we will know we've succeeded when people stop talking about blockchain. So you may be onto something there. Paul, please.
So we tend to talk a lot about the digital gap as mostly a consumer thing, but I think it's actually very much a small business thing as well. A decade from now, what I predict is that the last 20 to 30 years have been about larger companies getting much larger and industries becoming more concentrated. What people will be astonished to see 10 years from now is how networks of small companies are providing effective competition for the world's biggest companies, and that 2 decades of increasing industry concentration have been undone, and we live in a more competitive world, and one in which the benefits of digitization have been spread much more evenly to small and mid-sized companies and sole entrepreneurs around the world.
That is a profoundly hopeful vision, and I like it. That's very cool. Marta, take us home on this one.
Well, I'm very lucky to serve as the outside general counsel of Protocol Labs, which has been building technologies that underlie the decentralized web. I truly believe the decentralized web, or hope the decentralized web in 10 years will have fundamentally change the way we interact. And I hope that Filecoin will be the backbone of that.
Well, whatever the world holds in 10 years, you four are going to play a key role in making it happen. Of that, I am confident. I'm also confident that the GBBC and Blockchain Central, regardless of whether we're talking about blockchain, we will be talking about Blockchain Central, and the conversations that define the future of this ecosystem will still be going on here. Thank you to our extraordinary panelists for joining us today. I learned an immense amount from this conversation. I'm hoping all the guests at Blockchain Central did as well. And we look forward to continuing these discussions in the days, weeks, and months ahead as we all try to help the world recover from the crisis that we find ourselves in and hopefully build back in a way that will lead toward a better future. Thank you.